It is the 8th of May, 1772. Governor Joseph Wanton of the colony of Rhode Island sits down to pen a response to British Admiral John Montagu, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy in North America. Governor Wanton, like other Rhode Islanders, is fuming over what he sees as illegal search and seizure of coastal vessels coming in and out of Rhode Island ports. He has received numerous complaints from local merchants and plantation owners of the perceived overreach of a Royal Navy ship patrolling the bay. After exchanging letters with Lieutenant William Duddingston, commanding officer of the culprit, HMS Gaspee, Governor Wanton now unflinchingly writes to Admiral Montagu.
Sir, your letter, dated April the 8th at Boston, I have received. Lieutenant Duddingston has done well in transmitting my letters to you, which I sent him. But I am sorry to be informed there is anything contained in them that should be construed as a design of giving offense when no such thing was intended. But Mr. Duddingston has not behaved so well in asserting to you that he waited on me, and showed me the Admiralty and your orders for his proceedings, which agreeable to his instruction he is to do. But in that he has altogether misinformed you, for he at no time ever showed me any orders from the Admiralty or from you, and positively denied that he derived any authority either from you or the commissioners. Therefore, it was altogether out of my power to know whether he came hither to protect us from pirates or was a pirate himself. You say he has done his duty and behaved like an officer. I apprehend you must be mistaken, for I can never believe it is the duty of any officer to give false information to his superiors. As to your attempt to point out what was my duty as governor, please be informed that I do not receive instructions for the administration of my government from the King's admirals stationed in America. You seem to assert that I have endeavored to distress the King's officers from strictly complying with your orders. In this you are altogether mistaken, for I have at all times heretofore, and shall constantly for time to come, afford them all the aid and assistance in my power in the execution of their office. If you have really been informed, as you assert, the information you have received that the people of Newport talked of fitting out an armed vessel to rescue any vessel the King's schooner might take, carrying on an illicit trade, you have been greatly imposed upon, may be assured, is without any foundation and a scandalous imposition. For upon inquiring into this matter, I cannot find that any such design was ever laid, or so much as talked of, and therefore I hope you will not hang any of His Majesty's subjects belonging to his colony upon such false information. I am greatly obliged for the promise of transmitting my letters to the Secretary of State. I am, however, a little shocked at your impolite expression made use of upon that occasion. In return for this good office, I shall also transmit your letter to the Secretary of State, and leave to the King and his ministers to determine on which side the charge of insolence lies. As to your advice not to send the sheriff on board any of your squadron, please to know that I will send the sheriff of this colony at any time and to any place within the body of it, as I shall think fit.
The burning of HMS Gaspee, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. The events surrounding the Gaspee Affair, as it became to be known, trace back to the 7 Years' War, which took place from 1756 to 1763. This was a widespread, complicated, and global conflict that some historians call the first true World War, involving the Americas, much of Europe, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. Creator and host of American Revolutions podcast, Michael Troy, explains.
The 7 Years' War was started in America as the French and Indian War and moved over to Europe as a full-fledged war throughout there. But the war was really about who would control the North American colonies. The war started in what's today Ohio or Western Pennsylvania when a young colonel named George Washington went up there to demand that the French keep out of Virginia's territories. It ended up starting a whole war. That was a whole story in and of itself. But it ended up with Britain going to war with France and Spain and a bunch of other countries in Europe, all who were allies of various sides, all got involved, and it became a major world war.
On the 13th of September, 1759, France surrendered Montreal to the British, effectively ending the armed conflict in the Americas. But this was just one theater of a vast struggle for global supremacy, and the 7 Years' War continued to rage in Europe and Asia. Finally, on the 10th of February, 1763, with all sides physically, emotionally, and financially exhausted, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending all hostilities. The terms of this treaty vastly impacted the global map and the future of many nations for centuries to come.
The result of it basically was that Britain did pretty well. They came out of it with control of what had formerly been French Canada and Spanish Florida, and they were well in control of most of what we consider today North America. The other thing that was a result of the war was that Britain became very heavily in debt. So when Britain was trying to figure out how to get out of all this stuff, they thought, well, we've got this huge landmass in America that we need to govern now. And up until this time, it hadn't really taxed the colonies because it was really trying to encourage a lot of colonists to move there. And the tax situation was part of the benefits of living there. Now that they controlled most of the area without any dispute, they figured, all right, these economies have developed to the point where we can start imposing taxes. So that's what they did. And that's, of course, what started the beginning of the fights that leads us to eventually to the American Revolution.
The Kingdom of Great Britain began a series of actions in its North American colonies. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 prohibited settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and also prohibited colonists from trading with the native peoples in those lands. This put control of all westward expansion, settlement, and the lucrative fur trade in the hands of the Crown. Anyone wishing to trade had to purchase a license from the local governor. Furthermore, 10,000 soldiers were placed along the frontier to enforce this law, at a cost of £250,000 sterling per year to be paid by the colonists. In 1764 came the Sugar Act, which established duties to be paid on sugar and other commodities, and allowed smugglers to be tried in Admiralty Court without a jury. Prior to this, shipping was controlled by the Navigation Acts, which defined everything from the types of ships, routes, ports, cargo, duties, and tariffs. However, this system was very loosely enforced, and American merchants often ignored following any of these laws or paying the duties. Smugglers simply landed at ports where no British officials were present, or paid them off to look the other way. Merchants on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean were profiting, and it was commonplace for customs officials just to ignore it. This salutary neglect, as it was called, cut into the revenues that would ordinarily go to the British government. The Sugar Act put an end to this, as custom officials and the Royal Navy would now be rewarded for enforcing the Navigation Acts and collecting the proper duties. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," began to appear at this time in pamphlets and newspapers as colonial merchants felt the sting of paying customs duties. In 1765, the Stamp Act levied additional taxes on virtually every form of official document printed on paper. Later the same year came the Quartering Act, which required colonists to provide food and shelter to British troops. In 1766, Parliament repealed the extremely unpopular Stamp Act, but then issued the Declaratory Act, reaffirming the right of the British government to tax its North American colonies. All of these actions were meant to tighten the Crown's administrative control, provide increased revenue, and protect future profitable ventures such as land speculation and trade with the native peoples. Unrest in the colonies was growing as the British grip tightened on the colonists. In 1765, the governor of Rhode Island, Stephen Hopkins, published a pamphlet entitled Rights of the Colonies Examined. He writes, "Those who are governed at the will of another, or of others, and whose property may be taken from them by taxes or otherwise without their own consent and against their will, are in the miserable condition of slaves. Had the colonies been fully heard before the late act had been passed, no reasonable man can suppose it ever would have passed at all in the manner it now stands. For what good reason can possibly be given for making a law to cramp the trade and ruin the interests of many of the colonies, and at the same time lessen in a prodigious manner the consumption of the British manufactures in them?
Well, the Rhode Islanders were a pretty tough bunch, let's say. The British looked at them as a bunch of smugglers who needed to be put under control. They thought they were just trying to live their own lives and do business and being harassed by the British. You go back to 1764 and 1765. The Rhode Islanders actually fired on a British warship after there had been a dispute in town when their crew got into a fight with locals. But they literally mounted a local fort and fired cannonballs at the ship as it tried to leave. So a lot of people can say those are some of the first hostile shots that eventually resulted in the American Revolution. And this was back, I think, in 1764. And in 1765, there was another incident where they attacked a ship. So this was really nothing new. These were people who did not like officials getting into their business, and they were not afraid to express it in violent ways.
Despite growing unrest and resistance, the British government continued to push more and more taxes on its colonies. In 1767 and 1768, a series of legislation, collectively called the Townshend Acts, placed duties on common items such as paint, paper, glass, lead, and tea. More importantly, the revenue generated from these taxes were earmarked to pay the salaries of customs officials, the Royal Navy, and local governors. In addition, a board of customs officials was created to help enforce these laws and to prevent smuggling. Royal officials were given a vested interest in having these laws properly enforced. The colonists' reaction to these numerous acts was both swift and harsh, especially in Boston. Merchants interfered with customs officials and prevented them from doing their jobs. Later, during what was named the Liberty Affair, rioters destroyed the houses of customs officials, prompting British troops to occupy the city.
Well, the Liberty Affair, as you know, actually began in Boston when the ship Liberty was captured by British customs officials for smuggling, I think it was wine, into Boston Harbor. The ship was owned by a merchant by the name of John Hancock, which many of us know, because he went on to later and greater things. The British seized the ship there and made it into a customs ship. That resulted in huge riots in Boston. There were charges brought against Hancock for smuggling. Those charges were dropped, but the British kept the ship. That was a big fight among the colonists because they say, well, if he's not guilty of anything, why aren't they giving his ship back? So there was already a lot of tension there. The Liberty became a British customs ship and was used to track down potential smugglers and was used in and around Rhode Island. It ended up being in a dispute with the locals there, and the locals ended up boarding the ship and literally burning it down to its waterline and destroying it completely because they were upset at the way it was being used to what they thought was harass them in their efforts to do import and exports.
Afterwards, most of the Townshend Acts were repealed, with the exception for the taxes on tea, and both the British Army and Royal Navy had an increased presence in the colonies. The colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, which we'll simply call Rhode Island, although small in size, it offered excellent harbors, with the ports of Providence, Newport, and Bristol being very active in maritime trade. These ports offered smugglers a quieter, less trafficked option than the port of Boston, making it easier to avoid British customs officials. But by 1770, the creation of the Board of Customs Officials and other legislation resulted in increased enforcement of the Navigation Acts. The presence of Royal Navy ships in the harbors became more common, and smuggling became much more difficult. One of the Royal Navy ships that patrolled the coast of Rhode Island was the revenue schooner HMS Gaspee, commanded by Lieutenant William Duddingston.
The Gaspee was a British naval warship. It was a relatively small one, had a crew of about 20-25 people, 6 cannons. It had been in operation in the Americas for quite some time. The commander at the time, Lieutenant Duddingston, had been in command of the ship since 1768. His mission was to interdict smuggling anywhere along the American coast, and he actually operated anywhere between Philadelphia and Halifax. But the last few months prior to this incident, he had been focusing on the waters in and around Rhode Island. And Duddingston had a reputation for being a real ballbuster, if you'll pardon the expression. He would really go after everyone. If you took a little fishing boat out into the waters, he would sail up to you and demand to see your papers. He also had a reputation for being very abusive. He and his crew often beat up the crews and captains of merchant ships when they thought they were being uncooperative.
In February of 1772, the Gaspee entered Narragansett Bay and began stopping and harassing shipping, including coastal vessels trafficking between towns. Tensions rose between Rhode Island Governor Joseph Wanton and the British officials. On February 17th, the Gaspee stopped the sloop Fortune, which was carrying 12 hogshead of illegal rum from the West Indies. The rum was seized, and Duddingston sent the Fortune along with the rum to Boston, where it could be collected by British customs officials. Once again, here's Michael Troy.
There was a particular dispute in his efforts around Rhode Island because it was traditional that a British officer who was doing customs work in an area would go and present his papers to the officials in the local area. Duddingston didn't bother to do that. Many of the locals said that the Gaspee never showed the flag or showed any evidence that they were a legitimate customs ship. So a lot of ships that tried to escape it said they thought they were being attacked by pirates. So there was a lot of fighting about the methods they were using to harass the local shippers. And in fact, as I said, the governor had filed several complaints, and Duddingston, the commander of the Gaspee, was actually later criticized by a review board for not just for these activities, but his general activities about being very overly harassing and treating people with far too little respect.
Outraged, Governor Wanton wrote to Lieutenant Duddingston on March 22, 1772.
To the commanding officer of a schooner near Brenton's Point. Sir, a considerable number of the inhabitants of this colony have complained to me of your having, in a most illegal and unwarrantable manner, interrupted their trade by searching and detaining every little packet boat plying between the several towns. As I know not by what authority you assume this power, I have sent off the High Sheriff to inform you of the complaint exhibited against you, and expect that you do, without delay, produce me your commission and instructions, if any you have, which was your duty to have done when you first came within the jurisdiction of this colony. I am your humble servant, J. Wanton.
Duddingston, in turn, replied,
Sir, last night I received your letter informing me that a number of the inhabitants of this colony had complained to you of my having in a most illegal and unwarrantable manner interrupted their trade by searching and detaining every little packet boat plying between the several towns, in answer to which I have done nothing but what was my duty, and their complaint can only be founded on their ignorance of that. When I waited on you on my arrival, I acquainted you of my being sent to this government to assist the revenue, and had my commission to show you if required, as it was ever understood by all His Majesty's governors I have had the honor to wait on, that every officer commanding one of His Majesty's vessels were properly authorized, and never did produce it unasked for. The officer I send is equally qualified and has been in the boats at boarding most of the vessels, and can give any information relative to my proceeding.
Finding Duddingston's answer wholly inadequate, Wanton replied,
Yours of this day I have received, which does not give me that satisfaction I had a right to expect. Neither was the bearer of the letter qualified to give me any authentic information respecting the legality of that authority you have presumed to exercise within this colony. I expect that you do, without delay, comply with my request of yesterday, and you may be assured that my utmost exertions shall not be wanting to protect your person from any insult or outrage on coming ashore. I am your humble servant, J. Wanton.
Governor Wanton sent his sheriff to the Gaspee, and Duddingston was threatened with arrest. Frustrated, Lieutenant Duddingston sent the governor's letters to his commanding officer, Admiral John Montague. Montague wrote to the governor and questioned his loyalty to His Majesty's government. As for any further interference with the Gaspee, Montague wrote,
Let them be cautious what they do, for as sure as they attempt it, and any of them are taken, I will hang them as pirates. I shall report your 2 insolent letters to my officer, to His Majesty's Secretaries of State, and leave them to determine what right you have to demand a sight of all orders I shall give to all officers of my squadron, and I would advise you not to send your sheriff on board the king's ships again on such ridiculous errands.
The governor, not to be outdone, replied harshly to Admiral Montague and renounced much of his claims, which you heard at the top of this episode. Wanton made his position clear. Lieutenant Duddingston never in fact visited him, nor produced the necessary proof of his orders. More importantly, Wanton did not recognize the authority of the Royal Navy and the governing of his colony, and found their meddling with shipping to be illegal.
Now, I don't think it was actually required that they present papers. It was a custom, and it was a courtesy that was usually done. But clearly, Duddingston was operating under the authority of Montague, and he was where he was supposed to be as an officer. So I think it was more a matter of the British Navy trying to put local officials in their place and local officials demanding certain courtesies that they had been traditionally offered. Well, one interesting thing, too, was that the governor of Rhode Island was one of 2 governors that was elected by the colonists. All the other governors were appointed by a king or had some other method of being put in office. So the governor of Rhode Island had to be very responsive to the voters. These are the smugglers that we're talking about here. Had to be responsive to them and their needs and their interests. And he was very much an advocate for the locals, as opposed to, say, the governor of Massachusetts, who was appointed by the king and was often at odds with the rest of the colonists in the colony.
On June 9, 1772, the packet sloop Hannah left Newport, bound for Providence. It had just departed the harbor when it was approached by the Gaspee, and Duddingston attempted to stop and search the vessel. The Hannah had already cleared customs in Newport and had been given permission to sail. Its captain, Benjamin Lindsay, refused to stop, and the Gaspee gave chase. Lindsay, with the smaller vessel, took his ship into shallower water. HMS Gaspee followed, ran aground on a sandbar, and became stuck. Duddingston and his crew made every attempt to free the Gaspee, with no success. They would have to wait until high tide the following day to free their ship. Meanwhile, the Hannah continued on to Providence, and Captain Lindsay reported the incident to prominent leaders and merchants, including John Brown and Joseph Buckland. The men recruited more participants and organized a meeting at Sabin's Tavern to come up with a plan to destroy HMS Gaspee. Brown, being a merchant, had increasingly protested against the Gaspee's actions, and reportedly said, quote, "The opportunity offered of putting an end to the trouble and vexation she daily caused." The following day, in the early morning hours of June 10th, John Brown and his band of men quietly slipped into the harbor in 8 longboats, under cover of darkness. There were approximately 8 men in each boat, and the action was under the command of future Continental Navy Commander Abraham Whipple. The small armada of boats was spotted by the crew of the Gaspee, and the Rhode Islanders were ordered to stop, but the boats continued to approach. Whipple announced that he was a sheriff and had authorization to arrest Duddingston, but the lieutenant refused to allow the men to board. Shots were fired, and it is debated as to who fired first, but Duddingston was struck twice and badly wounded. Whipple and his men boarded the Gaspee, and a brief battle ensued, but the crew of the Gaspee were quickly overpowered. Duddingston was taken below decks and treated for his wounds, and the Rhode Islanders rummaged through the Gaspee's papers looking for anything of importance. Duddingston and his men were then ordered off the ship and were put on shore near Pawtuxet Village. The Gaspee was set on fire, and it burned down to the waterline before the powder magazine ignited, and destroyed what was left of the hull. News of the destruction of His Majesty's ship was met with outrage back in England.
Yeah, so after the destruction of the Gaspee, there was a investigation put into place. The sinking of a British Navy ship was, and the shooting of a British naval officer was a very, very serious matter for everyone involved. The governor really had the interests of the people at heart, but he had to put forth a good effort to find these criminals who were committing what was going to be charged as treason for attacking a British naval vessel. So he offered a reward of £100 if anybody could come forward with any information. They put together a committee to look into this matter, and surprise, surprise, they couldn't find anyone willing to come forward as a witness. If someone had come forward as a witness, they likely would have been tarred and feathered a few days later. They likely would have been ostracized by the local community. These were people that were really sticking together on this, so nobody was saying anything.
However, one witness was of particular interest to the British inquiry.
A few weeks after the incident, a British sailor who had been on the Gaspee when it was attacked recognized Aaron Briggs when he was on another ship and told the captain of that ship that Briggs was one of the people who had destroyed the Gaspee. Briggs, for a little background, is a 16, 17-year-old kid. He was an indentured servant to one of the important people in Rhode Island. He was also a black man. He had been indentured at age 5 and would have remained in service until, I think, age 24 under his service contract. So this is a young, impressionable kid who was scared for a lot of reasons. When he was accused of this crime, the captain basically forced a confession out of him and threatened to hang him if he did not comply. So he confessed to the crime, and he also named, I think, 5 other individuals who were involved in the attack on the Gaspee. While he was being held aboard this ship, the governor and others were trying to get him off the ship and talk to him. The captain refused to release him because they thought that if he was released, he would either be disappeared or would be forced to recant his testimony. So he actually was held on this other ship until officials could get a hold of him and really depose him and do everything they needed to do. Eventually, he was brought before this commission, which consisted not only of the governor, but also of several other officials from other colonies to get to the bottom of this matter. The governor, as I said, was an advocate for the locals and was very critical of this boy's testimony, which was also contradicted by 2 other people that directly contradicted his testimony, said, no, he wasn't there. He was somewhere else. We know where he was at the time and all this other stuff. So in the end, his testimony was discarded. His confession was thrown out.
The Royal Commission commenced hearings in January of 1773. Officers of the Gaspee were questioned about their reasons for being in Narragansett Bay. Witnesses from the local population were called, but nobody provided any credible information as to who was involved in the destruction of the Gaspee. Many in Providence knew who was involved, but none revealed any names. Admiral Montague arrived at the inquiry and demanded answers. He wanted names, and those people would be shipped to England to be tried. The threat of sending colonists to England for trial caused a stir of concern. Committees were formed in Virginia and in Boston to discuss how to respond to such an outrageous plan. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia later wrote in his memoirs, "A court of inquiry held in Rhode Island in 1772, with the power to send persons to England to be tried for offenses committed here, was considered at our session of the spring of 1773 as demanding attention." In December of 1772, the radical Reverend John Allen of Boston gave a rousing sermon entitled An Oration on the Beauties of Liberty, using the Gaspee Affair as his inspiration. "Is not the day of the watchmen of America come, who watch for the rights of the people, as the sentinels of the land, to defend them from every invasion of power and destruction?" The sermon was incredibly influential, and several editions of the complete sermon were published throughout the colonies. Exasperated and with the inquiry getting no results, the Royal Commission ended their investigation. Their report to the king concluded. The destruction of the Gaspee was by persons unknown. Nobody was ever charged or arrested for the destruction of HMS Gaspee. Lieutenant William Duddingston was arrested by the Providence Sheriff a few days following the ship's destruction. Admiral Montague paid his bail and promptly shipped him back to England to face court-martial. The Admiralty acquitted him of all charges, and Duddingston received a pension for wounds sustained during the Gaspee conflict. He returned to action in 1776 and was promoted to captain, then commodore, and eventually earning the superannuated rank of Rear Admiral in 1794. A musket ball which wounded him in 1772 remained in his body for the rest of his life and gradually worked its way down to his right knee, causing him to have a limp. William Duddingston died in 1817 at the age of 76. The Gaspee Affair was the first major armed act of rebellion by the colonists. While it resulted in little damage to the Royal Navy, it manifested greater tension and dissatisfaction of the colonists.
Well, the burning of the Gaspee happened in June of 1772, which in hindsight was kind of a low point in the level of violence between colonies and Britain. There had been a lot of fighting in the 1760s, kind of culminating in the Boston Massacre in 1770. And after that, things kind of went back to a low simmer, and they really didn't take off again until late 1773 when we have the Boston Tea Party. So this is in a period of relatively little violence going on, and both sides are kind of just eyeing each other, waiting to see who pulls the next punch. The Gaspee could have been a major explosive incident, but because it was being largely swept under the rug, it didn't have a big immediate influence on the course of events. The governor of Rhode Island, as I said, really just wanted this whole thing to go away, and effectively that's what he did, despite the fact that London really wanted something to happen. As I mentioned, the governor had offered a 100-pound reward for anybody coming up with information. When the king heard about that, he actually went back and said, no, we'll give a 500-pound reward to anyone. And this is at a time when, the average worker would be lucky to make 50 pounds a year. So a 500-pound reward was pretty substantial. And they were really demanding that something come of this, and it didn't. But so this incident really just became another incident where both sides showing that they were willing to take things, as far as they could to further their agendas. In the course of events, things went back to a low simmer again and for another year and a half. But it was clearly showing that the rebellious spirit went well beyond Boston and was present in a lot of other areas as well.
Notwithstanding the ramifications the Gaspee Affair held for the American Revolution, it should be noted that the Rhode Island ports were important cogs in the triangular trade, which involved the transportation and sale of enslaved people. The merchants and plantation owners of Rhode Island, some of whom were involved in the destruction of the Gaspee, profited from slavery either directly or through the trade of products such as rum and molasses from the Caribbean, which utilized slave labor. While the colonists were fighting for their freedom against tyranny, another group of people had no choice but to wait almost 100 years more for their own. That will do it for the burning of HMS Gaspee. Thank you so much for listening. Special thanks to Michael Troy of American Revolutions Podcast. You can listen and subscribe to American Revolutions Podcast wherever you get your podcasts or at blog.amrevpodcast.com. American Revolutions Podcast and Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs are both part of the Into History Podcast Network. Get ad-free access to these and many other wonderful history podcasts at intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. If you enjoy Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs and would like to support the show, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod, where you can make a donation of any amount you choose. Show notes, images, and sources are available at shipwrecksandseadogs.com, where you can also find merchandise. Get yourself a shirt and help support the show at the same time. Last but not least, if you haven't already, Please leave a rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen, and tell a friend about the show. Please join me again next time, but until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.